Good evening. My name is Scott Black Johnston. I'm the senior pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. Welcome to the 2021 Anita and Antonio Gotto Lecture. Tonight's lecture is co-hosted by the Reverend Patrick O'Connor and the transformative congregation of First Presbyterian Church in Jamaica, Queens. Reverend O'Connor will join us up front later this evening when we turn to a time of dialogue, but right now I would simply like to ask him to stand. This superb pastor and my friend, welcome. Tonight's conversation is made possible by a generous gift from two of New York's finest educators. In their heart of hearts, Anita and Tony Gotto are teachers. Anita, an elementary educator with an expertise in child development, and Tony, a renowned cardiologist and former dean of the Weill Cornell Medical School, saw the promise of this lectureship early on. It's because of their vision and their hard work that we're all here tonight. Anita couldn't make it tonight. She's feeling a little under the weather, but Tony is here. Tony, if you would stand and allow us to thank you. 4 years ago, Brooklyn singer and songwriter Gabriel Kahane wrote an article and a song entitled "How the Amtrak Dining Car Can Heal the Nation." In this piece, Kahane describes how, in an effort to try and understand America, he booked himself on a nearly 9,000-mile loop through this country on Amtrak. For 2 weeks, Kahane left his phone at home, he consumed no outside news, and he ate all his meals in the dining car. Because he was traveling alone, he was always seated at a table with 3 other strangers. This is how Kahane describes the experience. Where much of the digital world finds us sorting ourselves neatly into cultural and ideological silos, the train, in my experience, does precisely the opposite. It acts by some numinous, unseen force as a kind of industrial strength social lubricant. This ability to connect across an ideological divide on the train seems predicated on the fact that we were quite literally breaking bread together. Kahane goes on to say, "I mourn the decline of complex truth, the ability to hold 2 sides of an argument in mind, the desire to understand rather than simply to be right. We have, for the most part," says Kahane, "retreated into pure binary thinking." Since its inception, the Gotto Lecture has pushed back against our country's retreat into the binary. It's pushed back against the mind-numbing, soul-stealing notion that every conversation is only and ever a battle between 2 opposed political camps. Every year, this lecture has plunked us down in the Amtrak dining car and helped us to see a wonderfully complicated America, a country whose faith traditions are more nuanced and interesting, and ultimately more hopeful than we previously imagined. Tonight, we are honored to welcome the Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College and a priest in the Anglican Church in North America. Dr. McCauley is married to Dr. Amanda McCauley, a pediatrician and commander in the Naval Reserve. Together, they have 4 wonderful children. At least wonderful when last checked. Mainline Christians, like Presbyterians, often speak about other slices of the faith in terms of sweeping terms that often belie the complexity of these movements. This evening, we can't get away with that. This evening, we're going to sit down in the Amtrak dining car with a leading voice in American Christianity, who has received acclaim in the pages of the liberal New York Times and from the evangelical publication Christianity Today. Tonight, we're going to hear from a man whose approach to biblical interpretation was influenced by British theologian N.T. Wright, and whose rootedness in the Black church, and specifically the Union Hill Primitive Baptist Church of Huntsville, Alabama, sits at the heart of his engagement with America's passionate, ongoing conversation about race. It is indeed difficult to put any one label on this smart and fascinating fellow, and that, I think, is a good thing, a Christian thing. Honored guests, would you please give a warm welcome to our 2021 Gotto lecturer, the Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley, Jr.
I asked him not to do that, but he did it anyway. I am very grateful for that glowing introduction. I want to say thank you to Dr. Gotto and his wife for inviting me and my wife here, and I pray that the words that I say will be of some use to both him and the wider congregation here, both the congregations here. So what I'm going to do is something they probably tell you never to do as a speaker. I'm going to be overly ambitious and try to tell you 2 stories in about 30 to 35 minutes. The first story I'm going to tell you, I'm going to do much more quickly. I'm going to tell you the story of white Christianity over the last 200 years in 10 minutes, okay? And then after that, I'm going to take the next 25 minutes to tell you the story of the African American church. And I've entitled this Orthodoxy and Orthopraxy, the prophetic witness of the Black church. So first, the story that we tell. Now, it might be strange to have an African American come here and say, we're going to tell you the story of the Black church, and then begin with some children during the Industrial Revolution, but that's going to make sense in a second. The story that I was told when I left my Black Baptist church and I made my way into theological education, and they teach you what it means to be formally trained. And to be formally trained, you need to understand the story, the development of theological ideas. I'm going to tell you the story that I was told when I, as this young Black boy, made his way to seminary. And it often begins with the problem of the Enlightenment. During the 18th century, some of you might know this, they began to do things like doubt miracles. And so the supernatural aspects of the Bible are pushed aside. There's a high emphasis on the ability of human reason to solve all of our problems, and a strong distrust in authority, the move from monarchies to emerging democracies. Oh, shit, I forgot I got to push these buttons because I'm in charge of this, aren't I? Here we go. Now, one of the things that happened in this context is there was this idea that in order for Christianity to come of age and to be of use in the wider society, you need to remake Christianity in a way that's acceptable to modern man. As a matter of fact, it wasn't actually modern man, it was actually white European male. So I use the word man intentionally. And it was actually in this context that biblical studies was born. Do you all know that every year around Easter and Christmas, you get the true story about Jesus? And you see that in Times and Newsweek, the real Jesus behind the myth. And Jesus always turns out to be this shockingly progressive guy who was ahead of his time and who anticipated modern democracy. That Jesus, he was invented during this period. Right? It's amazing. Have you ever thought about how impressive it is that scholars do research on a guy from the first century and wonder of wonders he agrees with us and he shares our social, cultural, and political consensus? Okay, that Jesus was created during this period, and believe it or not, it was often done by people like me, biblical scholars. But if it's of any importance to you, it wasn't people who look like me, it was actually the Germans who did it. Okay. In this context, you have also what comes next is the Industrial Revolution. And you have the massive inequality and suffering in major cities out of the Industrial Revolution. And so they do things like they pass child labor laws in America and in the UK to deal with the problem of human suffering. But one of the other things that happens during the Industrial Revolution, and that you all saw this in New York, the movement from the rural communities into cities. And during that time, some of the people who moved from rural communities into cities didn't come to church. Because the problem of secularization is going on during the context of the Industrial Revolution. And this is actually when this is in this context, you see things like the temperance movement. One of the ways that people begin to respond to secularization is a heightened emphasis on morality. This idea that America is going down the tubes. We're kind of in this context again now, aren't we? Okay. So this is the question. And it's amazing when you think about this, but this is a question that in some sense we still haven't answered as a culture. In the context of the mass inequalities created by the Industrial Revolution, Christians began to ask this question: what is the role of the Christian faith in responding to social ills? People are suffering. What does the Christian gospel have to do about this? This is into what we now call the social gospel, the emphasis on Christianity's ability to meet the real needs of people. But at the same time, there's a second question that's being asked. How do Christians respond to questions about the historicity of certain aspects of the Christian tradition? So things like the virgin birth, the literal resurrection of Jesus. These questions, the miracles in the Bible, these questions are being asked at the same time. What do we do about the people who are suffering? And what do we do about the idea that modern man can't believe these myths about Christianity anymore? So it's in this context that you have what we call the fundamentalist mainline debates, which is shockingly still here, right? There are fundamentalists over here, or the unthinking Christians who don't care about the poor, and the liberals who don't believe anything. This is the story that we have, right? So this leads to the fundamentalist modernist debates, and the Christians are beginning to debate the different aspects of the relationship between suffering on one hand and what to believe about the miracles and the resurrection of Jesus on the other. And so you get what we now call the mainline churches and what becomes evangelical churches, who kind of come out of fundamentalism. And there tends to be, in white churches, the cluster of social action and revision become commonplace in mainline churches. So in other words, the mainline churches in general say, yes, we need to care about what's happening to the suffering peoples of the world, and we also need to rethink these aspects of Christianity that are now outdated. And then on the other side, you have the cluster of theological conservatism. We believe that these things are true, but we also don't think that social concern is something we should focus on. So in other words, you have basically the pre-modern manifestation of the woke and anti-woke versions of Christianity, right? So now, if you go into a church and you begin to talk about issues of social concern, the poor, police reform, there's often this assumption that you have abandoned some central aspect of Christian teaching. And you ask the question of why. I'm telling you why. It's because of this. One of the interesting things, though, is that I've told this story. So by the way, the story ends here, the white version of this story. The story ends here, And on one side, you have the evangelical church who say that the white liberals don't believe anything and you can't trust anybody who cares too much about poor people. And then in the socially progressive side of white Christianity, they say these unthinking fundamentalists are too literalistic and we should just avoid them at all costs. The interesting thing about this story is you can tell the entirety of this story, and this is the story that I was told when I went to seminary. But there was somebody who was left out of this entire story. And do you know who it is? Black people, right? You can tell the entire story of the history of theological development in the United States without mentioning slavery, Jim Crow, and the entire black church experience. And this absence is manifested both in evangelical circles and in mainline circles. Because if you go to theological education in mainline circles, black people often show up at this point too. We show up in the 1960s because James Cone just emerges out of nowhere, like a black guy walks out of the shadows, and here's the black church. And the question of what were the black Christians actually doing during that same 200-year period of history is often never asked or considered. And when we are considered, when black theologians are considered, they're placed within the binary already set up by white theological debates. And so James Cone and black liberation theologians are seen as taken aside in the fundamentalist modernist debate instead of being placed in dialogue with the wider black Christian tradition. So what I want to do, actually, is tell you all the other story. How do we do? Did we get this done in 10 minutes? You now know the history of the development of white theology in the United States, and now you're going to get 25 minutes of black people. Is that all right? I call this part Two Boats, One Gospel. And the reason I say that is because there's a way of looking at the American story in which you imagine a person who arrives on the Mayflower. And you look at the people who they encounter as they move throughout history. They encounter the indigenous people. They encounter Asian Americans who come in from the West. They encounter African Americans during slavery and Jim Crow. And the center of the story are the things that white people learn as they encounter people of color. But you get a much different story if you start the story on the slave ship. And you say, what do they experience as they move throughout the United States? And what do they learn about what it means to be a Christian here? And what are the issues and debates they have to deal with as they make sense of what it means to be a Christian in the United States? Now, I've given this talk enough time so that people get confused. I'm going to clear up some misunderstandings so that you don't have to ask me this during the Q&A. I'm going to save the first two Q&A questions already. So I'm going to talk about eventually African-American biblical interpretation. And I want you to understand this. Black people aren't magic. And when I say that, black skin does not give rise to magical readings of biblical text that are closed off from people with white skin. I don't believe that. What I do believe is that living as a black person in this country causes you to experience certain things. We live in a racialized world. And some of those experiences tend to cluster. So most African Americans tell you what it's like to be pulled over for driving while black. Most African Americans know what it's like to feel, to be followed when you walk through convenience stores and apartment stores. So these experiences give rise to certain questions, and we bring these questions to biblical text, and we come to a consensus about our experiences. So when I talk about black Bible reading and the black church, I'm not talking about black skin as magical. I'm talking about how blackness gives rise to experiences in the United States. And black Bible reading refers to the questions that we bring to the Bible based upon our racialized experiences and the insights that we find because we're looking for them. And this is actually true on one level of all biblical interpretation. In other words, once you move into a community and you begin to know the people there, the Bible, you see things in the Bible that you might not have considered. I'm assuming that when you came to New York from, where were you? Georgia. I'm assuming that you could turn the same passage and go, you know what? I preach this one way in Georgia, but I think New York needs a slightly different. Is that fair? Right? I tell, the way that I explain this to people is imagine Brown versus Board of Education was just passed. And a black pastor stands up in front of his congregation and he's going to preach a sermon based upon Ephesians 2. And a white pastor in that same city, I'm in the South, this is in Alabama, also has to preach. They could both be faithful expositors of the text, Because of their experiences, they're going to interpret it a little bit differently. So the second thing I want to say, though, is that black biblical interpretation, on one hand, speaks to the experiences of black people, but it also refers to the habits of a reading community that exists through time. In other words, at different points in history, African American churches have made theological arguments about the worth of black persons, and the best way to describe the people who they argued with were white churches. And so black biblical interpretation speaks to an ecclesial community that exists, that houses these readings. So I'm speaking on the one hand of the experiences that come from being black in America that leads to certain readings of the Bible, but I'm also trying to bear witness to a community that actually has a theological deposit that we can't erase. In other words, I'm trying to prevent the erasure of the testimony of the black church in the theological enterprise. Because I believe that their testimony matters, not just for black people, and not even just for North America, but in some ways for the world. Now, with those two misunderstandings addressed about what I mean when I talk about black, we can jump a little bit forward into the lecture. It's always good to dunk on your own tradition whenever you're going to say something critical. So this is actually the statement of an Anglican, and when I say Anglican, I mean actual Church of England minister in Virginia during the antebellum period. And this is what he forced the slaves to agree to before they could be baptized in Church of England churches. And he said the following: "You declare in the presence of God and before this congregation that you do not ask for holy baptism, have any design to free yourself from the duty and obedience that you owe to your master while you live, but merely for the good of your soul and to partake of the graces and blessings promised to the members of the Church of Jesus Christ." In other words, before you can become a Christian, you had to agree that God doesn't care about your freedom. And so immediately, you run into what we call in the African American Christian tradition, the body-soul dilemma. There are two ways in which black persons were perceived during this period. Either they were considered only souls, in that sense that God cared about your soul, so I would preach the gospel to you, but God didn't care about your body, so we can leave you in prison. This is actually what you still hear today. The people say, we should just focus on preaching the gospel and not get involved in this political stuff. This actually goes all the way back to the period of slavery. And it's the reason why black Christians have historically said, I'm not going to do that. The other thing that actually happened, though, the soulless, souls only and not bodies, the other thing we're perceived as is only bodies. And when I say that, I mean that because we weren't fully human, we were seen as less than intellectually and morally capable persons, then you could treat black bodies in any way that you wanted. So we're either treated with souls without a body or bodies without a soul. And it was the bodies without souls in which they would actually prevent African Americans from hearing the gospel and becoming Christians so that they could keep them in slavery. Shockingly, the evangelization of African Americans, when you told them they must agree to be slaves, didn't take. And so the initial evangelization of African Americans, they rightly rejected that version of the gospel. And what actually happens next is the Great Awakening. Now, the Great Awakening, they did this by accident. So they come down, once again, if you can imagine these people coming down in waves in places like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And the preachers of the Great Awakening unintentionally did something. And they started preaching the gospel, but they preached the gospel in a particular way. And they said that all people are sinners. And here's the problem, though. If all people are equally sinners before God, how can you have a social hierarchy? Now, most of the preachers of the Great Awakening didn't understand the ramifications of their preaching, but the black people did. They started doing some theology in the slave place. Like, hold on. If you're a sinner and I'm a sinner, you have no right to own me. And so they took the emphasis on the universal sinfulness and salvation by grace. God didn't have to give more grace to black people than white people to be Christians. That led to the mass conversions of African Americans during the Great Awakenings. The other thing that actually happened, and I say this a lot, is it was the polity of Baptist and Methodist churches. If you ever wonder why there's so many black Baptists, it's not because we're ontologically Baptist, right? That like black people refuse Presbyterian and Episcopal polity. That's not the issue at all, right? People think that, like, how do you get a black person to become a... Let me explain. And I say this as a former Baptist, no shade to any of the Baptists who might be here. What do you need to start a Baptist church? Nothing. A tree, right? You just go, and you can preach, and people come, you're the pastor. And so because the black people during that time could choose their own leadership, it led to the rapid expansion of Baptist and Methodist churches. In polities where there is a high structure, you know what actually happened? The white slave masters, or the white leadership of the denomination said, we need to find the black person who fits. And oftentimes the black person who fits was the black person who they could control. And the very stamp of approval by white denominations sometimes hindered the embrace of African American churches. So in other words, when black people were allowed to choose their own leadership, they grew more quickly. When they had to go through a system that filtered out some of the best black talent, they tended to suffer. So what happens when these churches are formed? I'm going to quote two people, a Methodist and then a Baptist, because they were the dominant forms of early black Christianity. This is the story of the foundation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We're in sometime around 1787. And I don't want to read the whole thing because I don't want to bore you too much. But I want you to pay attention. They talked about how they were in church, they were in a white church, and then they go in and they were kneeling during an act of prayer at the front of the congregation, and they were told to go back to the segregated portions, and because they were picked up and literally carried out of the churches. And he said, these other acts of unchristian conduct, we considered it our duty to devise a plan to build a house of our own, to worship God under our own vine and fig tree. One of the things I can't resist saying is somebody in this group will do this, will trace the use of vine and fig tree language from here through the parts of the American story all the way up to the inauguration, where this same line, the vine and fig tree, from the Bible is quoted. But the thing that you should attend to here, though, is that they wanted the freedom to be Christians. In other words, they didn't want to create a separate religion. They said that the racism and the anti-black racism that they experienced made it difficult for them to function as Christians. Now, this is what they did. I love this. So, we just read about the Anglican missionary in South Carolina who says before you are baptized, you must agree that God doesn't want to free your body. God is okay with you being a slave. Now, the AME creates their own catechism that you must agree to before you can be baptized. And this is the question they have. What shall be done for the extermination of slavery? Answer. We will not receive any person into our society as a member who is a slave owner, and any who are now members that have slaves, refuse to emancipate them after notification, shall be excluded. In other words, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. Now, I want you to understand that this is mostly notional. Most of the people in this church didn't own slaves. But they just wanted to make it clear to anyone who joined their community that to be a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church meant to recognize the essential worth of all people. And if you take a look then at the early formation of black churches, you see that most of them basically carried over the doctrinal emphases from their white churches that they were a part of into black churches, but they added a strong emphasis on social action, orthodoxy, and orthopraxy. This is my favorite quote, and until someone pulls it from my cold, dead hands, I will quote it in every lecture, no matter what the topic is. You can tell me about whatever it is, I'm going to pull this in here. This is William Simmons. It's almost enough to turn me back into a Baptist. We're 1887. We're a little bit down the road from the Civil War, and he's talking about what's happened to black churches since they have been founded. And he says the following, and I'm going to read this because I like it. God has permitted us, and through him, he has planted in us a vigorous spiritual tree. And since freedom, so we're like 20 years down the road, what has they been up to? Untrammeled. We have built thousands of churches, started thousands of schools, educated millions of children, supported thousands of ministers of the gospel, organized society for the care of the sick and the burying of the dead. Isn't that the church? Isn't that the church? Planted churches, educated children, cared for the sick. buried the dead. This spirituality and love of the offspring are indubitable evidences that slavery, though long and protracted, met in our race a vigorous, vital, God-like spirituality, which, like the palm tree, flourishes and climbs upward through opposition. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So, what comes from this early period of Black Christian development? If we had time, I would go through all of these, but I've been told that I have 35 minutes total. So I'm just going to point to them, and you have to believe me, and you can follow this up on your own. I like to say there's 4 streams of the African-American church that are born during this time period, coming into the early 1900s when you get the Pentecostals who come in last. Not last in worth, but they're just the latest comers. I've had Pentecostals yell at me before for saying it that way, so no Pentecostals yell at me after this. There's a transformational stream of the Black Christian tradition, and I've chosen James Pennington as a representative of it. There is, in this context, a strong emphasis on the condemnation of American hypocrisy as relates to slavery and injustice, but they also hold out the chance for the universal brotherhood of all of humanity. One of the most powerful things that you can read is James Pennington's letter to his former slave master. He writes to the slave master, I think it's maybe 10, 20 years after he escaped to the north, and he says to the slave master, "You're going to die soon, and you still have slaves under your care. You can free them and not have to go before God with that stain on your soul." And he says, "I've forgiven you, and that's the reason why I can write this to you." Like that idea, both a strong condemnation of the evil of slavery, but the possibility that he's writing to his former master saying that you can be better than this, is what I would say the transformational stream. There is another stream that I call accommodationalist. And this is very, very difficult to talk about because during the time period in which this occurs, the cost for radicalism was so high. So it's really easy to criticize people like Jupiter Hammond for sometimes pointing towards salvation in the next world more than freedom in this world. But in that context, they were literally under the eye of their slave master. But that tradition of African Americans who don't push back against racism and who look towards a glorious future is there, even if Jupiter Hammond is a complicated case. It's not actually a pure version of this, because if you're sympathetic to what the pressures that they go under. In other words, it's really easy to say we will all be James Pennington and we would all like run to the north and be free, but it's much more complicated than that. There's also the radical stream of Black Christianity that sees that on one hand wants to revise certain aspects of Christian tradition, and it sees God primarily in terms of a liberator. There's then also the pietist stream that comes a little bit later during the explosion of Pentecostalism in the early 1900s. I don't know if you know this, but Pentecostalism started with the Assemblies of God, which is actually the white Pentecostal denomination, comes out of Black Pentecostalism. And it was actually William Seymour who ordained the early Pentecostals, Black and white. And Pentecostalism is actually the only strand of Black Christianity that doesn't come out of white churches, but actually the white churches leave Pentecostalism and form the Assemblies of God, and they leave behind what becomes Kojic. Now, you should then, I would say, consider James Cone and the Black theology that he gives birth to in the 1960s as a manifestation of the Black radical tradition. You can trace what James Cone is doing through that stream of Black Christian thought that was there at the inception. But I think that tradition should be placed in dialogue with the transformational, pietist, and accommodationalist tradition within Black Christianity. In other words, I want to contend that in our modern academic discourse, we only really know about the Black radical tradition publicly, and we don't hear about the other aspects of the Black Christian tradition as it relates to popular discourse. Now, this is my claim. And it is borne out by an examination of what Black Christianity became in America. If you look at the major confession statements of the 7 historic Black churches, African American denominations, they stand squarely in the mainstream of Christian belief and practice. In other words, you go to the Church of God in Christ website, you go to the AME website, you go to the National Baptist Convention website, and you'll find the stuff that you find in most churches. The Trinity, the dual, Christ is fully God and fully man. You're saved by trusting in Jesus. You get the basic stuff that you find everywhere in Christianity. But they stand out in the fact that they often combine those traditional Christian beliefs with an advocacy for justice. And I want to say that the center then of the African American Christian tradition, what I call black ecclesial theology, a made-up word, but it's accurate, I think, is often out of place among other traditions. We talked about white evangelicalism, the white mainline tradition, and even in some sense, it's apart from the black radical tradition. And when I say that, I always have to be careful. I don't want to say that the black radical tradition is a manifestation of the black church. I don't want to say that. I've traced its development. What I want to say is the other elements of black Christianity don't get nearly as much public discussion and engagement. Sorry, I thought I had that up there. So what did they do then? And this is the question. So I'm reading all of these things, and I want you to know, I came to this just by spending a lot of time reading early African-American sermons and the testimonies of people who had escaped slavery. And I tried to say, what were they up to in these documents? And these were the things that I noticed that they were doing. They often critiqued anti-black racism based upon America's own stated ideals. One of the things you should really take a look at is during the period right around the Revolutionary War, you have these African-American, I think there's one letter to Connecticut and one letter to Massachusetts, the state representatives, and said, okay, you all are claiming that there's no taxation by representation, liberty, equality. Okay, you're doing this to start a revolution, but you enslave people. So the hypocrisy that we now see was actually stated by black enslaved Christians to portions of the American government, and they were ignored. But you see that often if you read the literature. How can you call yourself all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights while denying the rights of other people? That's the first thing they did. They also criticized racism or slavery based upon hypocritical Christianity. So first, you can't call yourselves good Americans if you have these ideals, and then you do this to us. Then the next thing they said is you can't call yourselves Christians. There are these passages where they say, like, you talk about the Bible, have you read it? Frederick Douglass had the slave master sermon that he would give as he went on his abolitionist tours, where he would mock the preaching of slave masters, and it would lead to riots, and he'd get run out from state to state to state to state. So they claimed their Christianity was hypocritical. They then claimed they're better readers of the Bible. So you are hypocrites. We read the Bible better. You read the Bible worse. The amazing thing about this is we all agree. We all agree. We all go back and we look and say, I would have been the abolitionist. They were clearly right. It's because they won a theological argument. The last thing that they did is they criticized the naked cruelty of slavery itself. They just described what happened to them and said, can you call yourselves a civilized country if you do this to us? This is a manifestation of at least some of this, right? This is Frederick Douglass towards the end of his autobiography, and he's spoken about Christianity so negatively throughout the course of the book, he says, I need to make a clarification at the end. And he says, what I've said about Christianity, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land, of no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So while that to receive one is good, pure, and holy, is a necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be a friend of one is a necessity to be an enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceful, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. That would have been retweeted to infinity. And they would have said, you know, his problem is his rhetoric, and he's not going to win people over unless he's much more measured. Anyways, the policing of the black voice goes back centuries. Okay, the important part here, though, is the distinction that he makes between Christianity as practiced in America and Christianity as depicted in the life of Jesus in the Bible itself. And he talks in particular about the evils that the Americans do to black people. So you see elements of the things I talked about in this quote. So then I started to ask myself, well, then how did they do it? How did they do it? How did they come to these conclusions about Christianity that were so different from their white counterparts? What were their methods? And the first thing that I started to notice is they were canonical and theological in their interpretation. And what I mean by that is that I say that some white Christians during this period had what I call Lord of the Rings theology, the one verse to rule them all, right? And so they said, here, slaves submit to your masters. And African Americans were like, okay, here is the book of Exodus, where God manifests himself as a liberator. Here are all of the passages in the prophets and the Psalms where God depicted himself as a God of justice. Here's the ministry of Jesus himself, where he stood alongside the suffering and hurting people of the world. Here is this idea. One of the things that you should really read, and it's in my book. I forget where it is. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. I don't know. I wrote it like 3 years ago. Who knows what's in that book? There's this when the slaves were writing to the state legislator, they said, in the Bible, it says that children should submit to their parents. Well, then how can a child submit to their parents if you can take that child and sell them down the road? In other words, they said that the ethics of Christianity pushes back on slaveholding. And you see how this isn't simply coming at it straightforward by looking at the 2 or 3 slave passages, but looking at the entirety of the Christian tradition. Other thing they did is they rescued Christian anthropology. Christian anthropology during this period had a functional hierarchy with the white people as the most human, black people as the less human, and different racial groups were categorized there. They said, no, the Bible says that we're all made of one blood. We're all image bearers. And because of this theological truth, right, that was in the wider Christian tradition, we're all made in God's image, they made that do political work to bring about the freedom of black people. Other thing I want to say, it was unapologetically socially located. I know I got to finish. And that it clearly arises out of the context of African Americans themselves. In other words, they were saying, hey, what does Christianity mean to this black enslaved person? There was never a time where black Christianity was apolitical, because the first question we had to ask ourselves was a political question. Does this God will my liberation or not? I talk about it being patient in that it had every reason to reject Christianity because of the way it was misused. And so there had to be this patient processing of the trauma of the misuse of the Bible to enslave black people, and African Americans had to work themselves back towards this place where they trusted the God depicted in those scriptures. The last thing I want to say is that they listened to both black and white critiques of the Bible. In other words, there's always been a black secular tradition that has said that because of what Christianity has done, Christianity is a white man's religion. And black Christians have always had to answer our ideological brothers and sisters who've left Christianity precisely because of this. But as I showed earlier, we've not actually been completely separated from the theological debates that were going on in white context. I can tell you about the fundamentalist and modernist debates, even if y'all have never heard of black pietism. You see the difference? And so it tends to be the case that African Americans know how to code switch, even theologically. So where are we? Where are we today? One of the things that happened is the internet created a clash of narratives. In other words, we're all together now, whether we want to be or not. And we're not actually hearing black voices. We're hearing African American voices, and we're repositioning them to see whether or not they support one of the different groups arguing in white Christianity. Or people assume that, for example, you can go and take a look at this. If you look at religious practices, African Americans line up most closely to evangelicals as it relates to Bible reading, prayer, church attendance. But actually, then if you look at political views, African American churches line up pretty squarely with, actually, this is true. There's one study, I don't know if this is actually bears out. There's one study that said that the closest political group of African American Christians is actually secular Jews, as far as political opinions as to how things relate. But it's also within the context of Christianity, it tends to be the mainline church. So we're now in this place where we're always together, and I don't think we actually understand each other very well. I think then that there's a possibility that black ecclesial theology that combines social action with a confidence in God and His Word as the gift for this moment. But here is the downside upon which I will end. We have offered this gift at least 2 times in American history. We offered it during the abolitionist movement, where we said, here is another way of being Christians, and it was rejected. And instead, we had Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. It was offered again during the Civil Rights Movement, and you had what occurred. And now we are at another phase of American history where the testimony of the black church that points to a better way of being Christian is once again on offer. And whether or not the black church is the only home for the Black Theological Project is an open question. Thank you.
Friends, we're going to switch our furniture around up here real quickly. In the pews are note cards that look like this, little 3x5 cards, and there should be little golf pencils there. That's for you to put your questions on. When you have a question finished, if you'll just pass it down to the end of the pew, one way or the other, and if that person would lift it up, we've got folks who are going to walk up and down and get the questions and bring them down front. And I'm going to turn things as we begin to collect the questions. I'm going to turn things over to my friend Patrick for the first question this evening. Patrick, the floor is yours.
So as a black scholar and author, if you were to talk about trends in black Christianity, what would those trends be considered?
I think that African Americans, theologians, are looking for a place where they can be their full selves. So I think that both in evangelical situations and mainline situations, there's a perpetual search for black scholars who are the right fit and who fit the culture of institutions, and finding a place where black scholars can be themselves outside of the gaze is something that I think is pressing. I think there's been an increase recently in what I call like the black audacity that comes from the black preaching tradition that's actually in academic discourse. In other words, if you ever go to a black church, I'm sure it happened, there's this point in the sermon where they say, I can't believe the pastor said that. Where he kind of cuts through all of the facade and gets to the heart of things. And I think that this moment, the last 5 years, has led to a lot more audacity in black scholarship. And they're just speaking it as they feel it, and with more abandon. I think that there is, if I could push back on one thing that I don't I think there's a little bit more nihilism, or there's a sense in which you can understand why, a sense that the problem of race in America is intractable, and there's a little bit of despair. That I think is marking the enterprise. Sorry, and this is the last one, forgive me for giving too many answers. Whenever there's a large pushback on, when there's an increase in anti-black racism, there's a corresponding emphasis on blackness. So if you remember back in the 80s and early 90s when we were all wearing those African medallions and we all got super African names for a little bit, it was in response to coming out of the Reagan years. You're seeing a similar emphasis, like the Black and Proud music during the Civil Rights Movement. So whenever there's a rise in anti-black sentiment, we all then begin to reconstruct and then re-emphasize blackness. And there's been a heavy emphasis on I would say the re-emphasis on the worth of blackness, like black girl magic, black is beautiful, I'm rooting for everybody black. That language kind of spikes during periods of racial discord. So if you think about it, like it's happened more over the last 5 years than like the 20 years prior. So that's what I would say, like a strong re-emphasis on the worth of blackness given anti-black racism, a little bit of nihilism because this feels like something we should have been done with, and a little bit more audacity would be some trends that I see.
Thank you.
Esau, this question arises out of my own reading of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, which I found both a powerful and a painful book to read. And one of the things that Coates says in his book, and he's an avowed atheist, as many of you know, he concludes that there's no hope.
Yeah.
You were just speaking about the nihilist strand. In some scholarship, he concludes that there's no hope to be found in the black church. The subtitle of your book, however, is An Exercise in Hope. So can you talk about how do you get to such different places, and maybe dialogue with Coates a little bit, who's become...
So I told you, you win the award because that is one of the best questions I've ever gotten about my book. Because and this is serious, part of this book can be seen as an implicit dialogue with black nihilism. That's actually who I had in mind during the parts of the book that I was writing it. And the reason it was Exercise in Hope, because I saw it. I was coming back from America doing my PhD in the UK, and I saw the explicit rejection of Christianity during elements of the black protest this is the first round, not the 2020 round, the 2016 round, 2015 to 2016. And I remember this one protester saying, "This isn't your parents' civil rights movement." And I said, well, hold on. Like, I understand why there's this feeling, but I felt like, the chapter, the first part of my book is called The South Got Something to Say. And it was both me being a Southerner, but also the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the black civil rights movement, and black Christianity out of the South. And so part of my book was an implicit way of saying the things that you care about as a black person troubled by what you see in the world are there in the scriptures. The Bible, affirms your blackness as good. The Bible has something to say about political protest. The Bible has something to say about justice. The Bible has something to say about policing. So you can see my book is actually trying to counter what I saw as this growing nihilism. But what the other thing, it's called An Exercise in Hope. And you all might not be able to tell this, but I actually run a lot. But I run slow. And oftentimes, I don't want to get up and run. But I realize that if I want to live to old age, even if my knee's hurting and I'm tired, I got to get up and exercise. So exercise is a discipline. And so I wanted to give hope, not as this simple, like, you can just be hopeful, but you can exercise. You can choose to be hopeful. And the point that I said at numerous points in the book is the very act of looking in the Bible to see a God who's a friend and not an enemy. Just the opening of that book was an exercise in hope. And so what I wanted to do was to encourage people to keep doing that. But it really is in dialogue with a form of nihilism. But to put it even more finely, is the resurrection upsets our plausibility structures, right? I mean, so you can say, look at the history of white supremacy in America, and I say, look at the empty tomb. And I feel like God is more powerful than white supremacy. So I just, as long as I believe the tomb is empty, I can't say there's something more powerful than God. And even anti-black racism isn't more powerful than God. And so I just don't have it as a part of my theological vocabulary to completely give up hope. It doesn't mean that I believe that we can transform America into a utopia. But in the same way, I put it this way, greed is a persistent reality. We're all going to struggle with wanting more. But I know that. I may never eliminate greed, but I got to live every day as I'm going to fight against it. And I consider racism the similar kind of besetting sin that I don't therefore give up on. And so as a Christian, I don't think you can give up on fighting sin. I think racism is a sin.
So here's a
I'm turning back
question about anger and rage. In an effort to vanquish or rage, could you list 5 incremental steps that could take us from today's Black Lives Matter to the end of racism in America?
I'm not sure that we do get rid of rage. I wrote the chapter on Black rage because it was a part of the Black experience. There's the famous James Baldwin quote, to be a Negro in America and to be semi-conscious of being in a rage and all of the time. I just don't understand what you feel when you see someone stepping on the neck of a Black man other than rage. It comes, right? It's a part of the human experience. The question is, what do you do with the rage, right? So one of the things that you never, like the psalmist, and this is the reason why in the book I turn to the psalmist. The psalmists direct their frustration to God. We tend to think that like God will only hear us once we get to an emotionally healthy place. If we can give God our pious thoughts. God, I was mad, so I left you alone. Now I recognize your goodness, and I can pray to you in this voice, right? But no, the psalmists are crying out to God. Why did you allow this to happen to me? And so I think part of the Christian life is no longer to see sin. Like, how can you see what happens to Black people and not be upset? You should be. But the question is, what do you do with it? You offer it to Christ, you offer it to God, and then you use it to spur you on towards justice rather than destructiveness. There's a destructive kind of rage that becomes bitter, that burns down both the object of its anger and the person. It's the Howard Thurman quote, like the anger is a fire that burns down more than intends. So sometimes if you're angry, you feel like, I will let this rage push me out into the streets. But that kind of dysfunction comes home. And it sometimes interact and influence how you interact with your children or your spouse. And so I don't believe that we can ever no longer look upon the suffering peoples of the world and not be upset. I do think that Christianity tells us what comes on the other side of that anger. And it's a Christian faith that says, I will turn that anger or frustration about injustice towards action. And forgive me for belaboring this point. There's all these questions that people ask about theology, and they want it solved so we can put it away. But maybe that problem that's in you is supposed to spur you to action. In other words, if I answered your problem about rage and then you're not married anymore, then the Black people continue to suffer. But as long as you're angry about it and it spurs you to action, then there's something good that can come from it. So that's probably the best I can answer it for it. So I don't have 5 steps to no longer be angry. Like, I'm angry. But God is good. It's probably, so like, it's the anger is at the end.
This question tries to bring another voice into the conversation. And this person asks, what might it look like for Asian American Christians to build solidarity with Black Christians in light of public narratives of Asian Black animosity?
Oh man, I give this lecture. So let me answer this question well. So many emotions you spread up there. First of all, in Chicago this year, there were Asian American churches and Black churches were together marching around both anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism during the pandemic. So this Asian American Christian Collaborative is the name of that organization, and they're doing some work not just in Chicago, but all over the country. So the Asian American community is finding their voice. I don't want to say that because what do I know? But I've seen that publicly happen. I would say that it is important for all of our communities to own their biases. When I teach my students on this, there's a class I teach called The Bible and Theology in Color. And y'all may remember, maybe you don't, maybe this is a different cultural context, but in the movie Do the Right Thing, at the very end, there's a scene at the end where a Black man is killed and there's a riot that's about to take place in this, it takes place in Brooklyn, right? And when the riot is about to take place, they're about to actually burn down the Korean store. And the Korean man goes, I'm Black too. And the older Black man goes, you're not Black. But it's an actual interesting dialogue around the dynamics between the shop owner as both a victim of oppression himself and someone who lives in an ambiguous place in the community. And so I do think there actually needs to be actual dialogue between African American and Asian American communities. I've talked about this before. It's like I didn't realize that I was raised with Asian American stereotypes until I got caught. So wait a minute. I was raised to be hostile towards Asian American business owners because they were buying up black property. And I never thought about them as immigrants who were experiencing their own forms of discrimination. And so I had to think about my own upbringing and my own family and pushing back on those things. And so I think that there needs to be real conversation around anti-Asian racism in black communities, and anti-black racism in Asian communities. It needs to be real dialogue and healing. So that it's not just a series of bilaterals where each ethnic group, minority ethnic group, is saying to the majority white culture, here are your problems. I think we need to do our own internal work too. And I have actually benefited greatly from reading Asian American theology myself. I'm not competent to speak too much more about it other than to say I found it very transformative. It helped me to put in context some experiences that were alien to me. It helped me to see the shop owner is probably the best way to put it, and do the right thing.
Wrestling with white guilt. What's a posture that you would recommend to both black and white Christians as they wrestle with white guilt and how and whether to reform or rescue white Christianity?
Oh, man. This is what I want to say. Paralyzing guilt is a privilege. And what I say by that is that sometimes there can be so much work helping white Christians deal with the trauma of coming to grips with American history or church history, that's all that we do. And I think that one of the gifts of African American Christianity is we never bought the propaganda. In other words, we've always known the church was messed up, and we were Christians anyway, because there were slave masters when we converted. And so one of the hard things to happen is that when you've seen yourself as the hero, to recognize, oh, I was actually the bad guy in this story. And there can sometimes not be a way to imagine a Christianity on the other side of owning that trauma of recognizing, oh, I thought we were the good guys, in so many places we're the bad guys. So the way that I try to reimagine talking about the history of the church or the history of this country is that what makes America wonderful is not that we always choose the good, the true, and the beautiful. We don't. There's too many receipts, right? What makes America special is this is the place where the oppressed peoples of the world have fought for justice and overcome those things, right? So when you tell the story from the underside, right, you say the people who left the internment camps who then sued the United States government, right? That's a story of courage. Right? And so we have to learn to tell the story of the stepped-on peoples as the heroes. And we have to learn how to acknowledge it's almost like the disciples when, they don't know how to handle Jesus when he's resurrected. And they go, does Jesus still want us on the team, right? There's this awkward moment where he's back and he goes, peace be with you. And the whole point of that and the restoration of Peter at the end of John's gospel is yes, you have failed, Peter, but there's still a future for you in the church. And Peter's dirt is in the Bible, right? You can't read the Gospels without knowing Peter's failure, and Peter's still at the church. But we feel like unless there can be some kind of vindication that it really wasn't that bad, that there can't be leadership. But no, you can participate in the church, but you got to own your failure. And so what I would say to my white Christian brothers and sisters is let go of the glory narrative. And embrace the narrative of the cross. And then do the work yourself. Go as far as you can in your reading and your understanding. And when you get to the place where you feel like I've gone as far as I can go, then go to your black friend. Don't expect them to take you from point A to point B. We write these books for a reason, right? So that you would leave the 5 black people in your congregation alone during coffee hour, all right? So I'm not saying, I don't care if you buy my book or not. I'm just saying there are resources that exist where you can begin to go through the process of educating yourself. And so and the perfect example of that is when I started, and I hate it when I'm the good guy in this story. Forgive me, I don't usually tell this, but it can't. So when I started recognizing my own hypocrisy, I'm saying read black people, and I didn't read any Asian American theology. I emailed my friend Jeanette Oak at Fuller Seminary. I said, Jeanette, I don't need you to teach me anything. Give me 5 or 6 books, and I'll just work through them. And that's what I did. That's what I did. And so I do think there's a sense in which you can educate yourself and be basically aware, because some of the questions you may think are hot takes, we've asked and answered 50 years ago.
I cannot think of a better way to end this evening than with that answer, which is phenomenal. I want to thank all of you for coming, especially our good friends who traveled over here this evening from Queens. We love you, and we cherish the relationship that continues to grow between these two congregations. Thank you for coming. I want to say to the folks who are out there on live stream right now, thank you for joining us this evening. If you want to recommend that somebody who wasn't able to tune in tonight catch this fabulous lecture, it will be available on our YouTube channel by tomorrow morning, and you can share it far and wide. I loved Esau's comment earlier. This thing would have been retweeted to infinity. You can do the same with this lecture. And I want to remind you this evening that our exit protocols are for the congregation to go through those clear glass doors back there and out onto Fifth Avenue. Thank you. Bless you. Good night.
I really want to say thank you all for coming. I know he said I talk too much, but what do you want me to do? I know what it's like to have real jobs and to make time on an evening to come out here and listen to me. It actually means a lot. And so I thank you, and your churches and your communities will be in my prayers. Do not give up. Do not lose heart. He is risen. All will be well. Thank you.